The sun hung like a brass coin against the bleached sky when Jake Morrison first heard the scream echo up from Devil's Canyon. He'd been mending fence along the north pasture, sweat cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face, when that sound froze him solid as winter ground. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the death shriek of a rabbit caught by a hawk. It was human, and it was desperate. Jake dropped his tools and sprinted toward the canyon rim, his worn boots kicking up small clouds in the hard-packed earth. The Morrison Ranch stretched for thousands of acres across this corner of New Mexico territory, but Devil's Canyon cut through it like a wound that wouldn't heal. Folks said it got its name from the way the wind howled through the rock formations at night, but Jake had always figured it earned the title from all the trouble that seemed to find its way down there. When he reached the edge and looked down, his breath caught in his throat. Maybe 30 feet below, wedged on a narrow ledge of red sandstone, was a woman. Her blue dress was torn and dirty, her dark hair had come loose from whatever pins had held it, and even from this distance he could see blood on her hands where she gripped the rock face. "Hey there!" Jake called down. "You hurt bad?" She looked up, and even through the shadows he could see the relief flood her face. "I don't think anything's broken," she called back, her voice shaky but clear. "But I can't get back up, and I'm afraid to move much. This ledge doesn't feel too steady." Jake studied the situation. The canyon walls were steep but not impossible to navigate if you knew what you were doing. He'd climbed down there as a boy, looking for arrowheads and adventure. But that was 20 years ago, and he'd been lighter then, more reckless with his own neck. "What's your name?" he called down. "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell." The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Mitchell. He'd heard that name spoken in hushed tones around town for the past month. The Mitchell family had been murdered on their homestead 40 miles east, burned out by rustlers who'd been plaguing the territory all summer. Word was that one daughter had survived, had disappeared into the wilderness. The law had given up looking for her weeks ago, figured she was dead. "Sarah Mitchell," he repeated. "The homesteader's daughter?" A long pause. "Yes." Jake's mind raced. If this was really Sarah Mitchell, she'd been living rough in the wilderness for weeks. The fact that she was alive at all was a miracle. The fact that she'd ended up on his land felt like something more than coincidence. "I'm coming down," he called. "Just hold tight." "Wait," her voice carried a note of panic. "Are you alone?" The question made him pause. Of course she'd be suspicious of any man after what had happened to her family. "Yes, ma'am. Name's Jake Morrison. This is my ranch you're on." Another pause. "Morrison." She seemed to be testing the name. "I've heard that name. You're the one who stood up to the Cattlemen's Association when they tried to run off the small ranchers." "That's right." He was already looking for the best route down, mapping out handholds and footholds in his mind. Though it didn't do much good in the end. "It did more good than you know," she said quietly. Jake began his descent, moving carefully from one handhold to the next. The sandstone was solid enough, but the summer heat had baked it until it was almost too hot to touch. Halfway down, his boot slipped on a patch of loose gravel and he had to catch himself hard, scraping his knuckles raw against the rock. "Be careful," Sarah called up. "I'm not worth you getting hurt." "That's not for you to decide," Jake replied, continuing down. When he reached the ledge, he could see just how precarious her situation really was. The shelf of rock she was perched on was maybe 3 feet wide and 8 feet long, with a sheer drop to the canyon floor another 60 feet below. Worse, he could see cracks running through the stone where it joined the main wall. It wouldn't hold much longer. Up close, Sarah Mitchell was younger than he'd expected, maybe 22 or 23, with intelligent green eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw that reminded him of his own sister. Her dress had once been fine quality, but weeks in the wilderness had reduced it to little more than rags. Her hands were cut and calloused, her face burned by the sun and wind. "How long have you been down here?" he asked. "Since yesterday afternoon. I was following the creek bed, looking for a way out of the canyon, when some rocks gave way above me." She gestured weakly at a scar in the cliff face where a small landslide had recently occurred. I fell, caught this ledge. Been afraid to move much since then. Jake tested the stability of the ledge with his weight and didn't like what he felt. The whole shelf was slowly separating from the main wall, held by little more than friction and prayer. We need to get you off here fast, he said. This whole thing's going to come down soon. Sarah's face went pale, but her voice stayed steady. What do you need me to do? He studied the cliff face above them. The route he'd taken down was too difficult for someone in her condition, but there was another possibility. About 15 feet up and to the left, he could see a narrow chimney in the rock that might lead to a more gradual slope. I'm going to climb up to that crack in the wall, he pointed. Then, I'll drop a rope down to you. You'll have to trust me to pull you up. She looked at the route he'd indicated, then, at the growing cracks in her ledge. Do it fast, rancher, she said, meeting his eyes with a calmness that surprised him. I promise not to scream. Jake almost smiled despite the situation. I'll hold you to that. He began the climb to the chimney, moving as quickly as safety allowed. Behind him, he could hear small pieces of stone breaking away from Sarah's ledge and clattering into the depths below. The sound made his stomach clench, but he forced himself to stay focused on the rock in front of him. The chimney was barely wide enough for his shoulders, but it was solid, carved by centuries of flash floods into the heart of the canyon wall. He wedged himself into it and began working his way up, using his back against one wall and his feet against the other. It was exhausting work in the heat, and by the time he reached a secure position 20 feet above Sarah's ledge, his shirt was soaked with sweat. He pulled the coiled rope from his shoulder and secured one end around a sturdy boulder. The other end he dropped down to Sarah, who caught it on the first try despite her obvious fatigue. You ever done any climbing? He called down. Not like this, she replied. But I learned fast. Good. I'm going to pull from up here, but you'll need to help by walking up the wall with your feet. Keep your body away from the rock face, lean back into the rope. I understand. Jake took a firm grip on the rope and began to pull, feeling Sarah's weight come onto the line. She was lighter than he'd expected, probably hadn't been eating well during her weeks in the wilderness. He could hear her feet scrambling against the stone below as she tried to find purchase. They were maybe halfway up when he heard the sound he'd been dreading, a deep, grinding crack followed by the crash of falling rock. Sarah's ledge had finally given way, taking with it her only refuge if something went wrong with the climb. It's gone, she called up, but her voice was still steady. Guess there's no going back now. There never was, Jake replied, continuing to pull. Keep climbing. Hand over hand, he hauled her up the cliff face while she walked up the wall below. His arms burned with the effort, and his hands were slick with sweat where they gripped the rope, but he didn't slow down. When her hands finally appeared at the edge of the chimney opening, he grabbed her wrists and pulled her up beside him. For a moment they both just sat there, breathing hard, pressed together in the narrow confines of the rock chimney. Jake could smell the desert sage in her hair, could feel the tremor in her hands that she was trying to hide. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. We still need to get to the top. The rest of the climb was easier, following the chimney up to where it opened onto a more gradual slope that led to the canyon rim. When they finally emerged onto the flat ground above, Sarah collapsed to her hands and knees, shaking with exhaustion and relief. Jake knelt beside her, unsure whether to offer comfort or give her space. He settled for pulling his canteen from his belt and offering it to her. She drank deeply, water spilling down her chin and onto her torn dress. Easy, he said. Not too much at once. She nodded and handed back the canteen, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. I'm sorry. I haven't had much to drink in the past day. How have you survived out here all this time? Her face darkened. Very carefully. Jake waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. Instead, she looked around at the landscape surrounding them, the rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and juniper, the distant mountains purple against the horizon. Your ranch, she said. It's beautiful. It's home, Jake replied. Or it was. Not sure how much longer I'll be able to hold on to it. The rustlers? Among other things. He stood and offered her his hand. Come on. Let's get you back to the house. You need food and rest. Sarah took his hand and let him help her to her feet. She swayed slightly, steadying herself against his arm. Mr. Morrison, I need to tell you something before we go any further. Jake. And, what's that? The men who killed my family, who burned our farm. They're still out there. And, they're still looking for me. Jake felt his blood chill. Looking for you specifically? I saw them, she said simply. I saw their faces, heard their names. I can identify them all. The implications of her words settled over him like a dark cloud. If the rustlers knew she was alive, they'd stop at nothing to silence her. And, if they tracked her to his ranch. How do you know they're still looking? Because they came back, Sarah said. 3 days after the attack, they came back to search the ruins of our house. I was hidden in the root cellar, but I heard them talking. They know I got away, and they know I can hang them all. Jake's mind was racing. Harboring a witness to murder would paint a target on his back that he wasn't sure he could handle. His ranch was isolated, his nearest neighbors miles away. He had 2 ranch hands, both good men but neither particularly handy with a gun. But, looking at Sarah Mitchell, seeing the exhaustion and fear she was trying so hard to hide, he knew he couldn't turn her away. It would be like sentencing her to death. How many of them were there, he asked. 6. Maybe 7. It was hard to tell in the dark. You know any of their names? Sarah's eyes hardened. Their leader calls himself Colt Jameson. Big man, black beard, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The others? I heard some of the names. Reeves, Dutton, Amos something. Jake knew those names. Every rancher in the territory knew those names. The Jameson gang had been terrorizing homesteaders and small ranchers for months, always staying one step ahead of the law. They were ruthless, well-armed, and smart enough to keep moving before any organized resistance could form against them. Sarah, he said carefully, I need you to understand what you're asking of me. If I take you in, if I help you, I'm declaring war on some very dangerous men. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not asking you for anything, Mr. Morrison. I'm grateful for what you've already done, but I won't put you and your men in danger. If you'll just point me toward the nearest town. The nearest town is 40 miles through desert that's crawling with rattlesnakes, coyotes, and Apaches who aren't too fond of white folks right now, Jake interrupted. You wouldn't make it 5 miles on foot in your condition. Then, what do you suggest? Jake really looked at her. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the fear and exhaustion, there was something unbroken in Sarah Mitchell. A strength that reminded him of the women who'd helped settle this territory, who'd faced down Indians and drought and all the other hardships the land could throw at them. His father had always said that the measure of a man wasn't in what he could build, but in what he was willing to sacrifice to protect. Jake's ranch was his life's work, but it was also just land and buildings. Sarah Mitchell was a human being, and she needed help. I suggest we go to the house and figure this out over a hot meal, he said finally. Whatever happens next, you're safe here tonight. The relief that flooded her face was answer enough. They walked back toward the ranch house in comfortable silence, but Jake's mind was anything but quiet. He was thinking about defensive positions, about how many shells he had for his rifle, about whether his 2 ranch hands would stand with him when the trouble came. Because it would come. Men like Colt Jameson didn't leave loose ends, and Sarah Mitchell was the loosest end imaginable. The Morrison ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwoods beside a creek that ran year-round, fed by springs in the hills above. It was a solid structure, built from local stone and timber that Jake had cut himself. 2 stories, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that commanded a clear view of the surrounding terrain. As they approached the house, Jake could see his ranch hands, Tom Riley and Miguel Santos, working in the corral with a string of horses they'd brought down from the high pastures. Both men looked up at the sight of Jake returning with a stranger, and he could see the questions forming on their faces. Tom, Miguel, Jake called as they reached the yard. "Come over here a minute." The two men approached cautiously. Tom was in his 50s, a grizzled veteran of the range wars who'd worked for Jake's father before him. Miguel was younger, maybe 30, but he'd grown up on ranches and could read sign like an Apache tracker. "This is Sarah Mitchell," Jake said without preamble. "She's been hiding out in the wilderness since her family was murdered by the Jameson gang." Both men's faces grew serious. They'd heard about the Mitchell massacre, just as everyone in the territory had. "She can identify the men who did it," Jake continued. "Which means they'll be looking for her." Tom spat into the dust. "Jameson's bunch. Heard they've been working their way west, hitting the smaller spreads." "They'll come here eventually anyway," Miguel added. "Been hitting ranches all along the territorial line. Only a matter of time." Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward both men. No questions about whether helping Sarah was the right thing to do, no concerns about the danger it might bring. Just acceptance and a willingness to face whatever came next. "I won't blame either of you if you want to draw your pay and ride out," he said. "This isn't your fight." Tom looked offended. "The hell it isn't. Jameson's gang burned out the Petersons last month, killed old Pete when he tried to stop them from taking his horses. Far as I'm concerned, this fight's been coming for a while." Miguel nodded agreement. "Besides, Senor Jake, this is our home too. We don't run from trouble." Sarah had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke up. "I appreciate what you're all saying, but maybe there's another way. If I could get to the territorial capital, find the marshal." "Marshal Thompson?" Tom laughed bitterly. "He's got half the territory to cover with maybe a dozen men. By the time he could organize a posse and get out here, we'd all be buzzard food." "Tom's right," Jake said. "The laws spread too thin out here. Most of the time, folks have to handle their own problems." Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly. "So what do we do?" Jake looked around at his ranch, the house his father had built, the corrals and outbuildings he'd added over the years, the land that had been in his family for 2 decades. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was everything to him. "We get ready," he said simply. "And we make them pay a price they won't forget." That evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, they gathered around the kitchen table to plan their defense. Sarah had cleaned up and changed into one of Jake's sister's old dresses that he'd found in a trunk upstairs. With her hair combed and the worst of the trail dirt washed away, she looked younger but also stronger somehow, as if the simple act of being clean and safe had restored some of her natural confidence. Miguel had prepared a meal of beans and beef, with biscuits and gravy that Sarah ate as if she hadn't seen food in days. Which, Jake reflected, she probably hadn't. "Tell us about the attack," Jake said when she'd finished eating. "Everything you remember." Sarah's face grew distant. "It was just after midnight. I'd been up late with Ma, helping her with some sewing. Pa and my brother David were already asleep. I heard the horses first, then voices outside." She paused, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "Pa got up to see what was happening. They shot him through the door before he even got it open. Then, they came inside, and—" "Take your time," Jake said gently. Sarah took a shaky breath and continued. "They were looking for something. Not just money or valuables. They kept asking Ma about papers, about documents Pa might have hidden. When she said she didn't know what they meant, that's when they hurt her." "What kind of papers?" Tom asked. "I don't know. Pa never mentioned anything special. We were just homesteaders, trying to make a living on our 160 acres. Miguel frowned. "Senor Jake, you remember what the land agent said last month? About some of the homestead claims being challenged?" Jake nodded slowly. There had been rumors that some of the larger cattle interests were trying to invalidate homestead claims, claiming the original surveys were faulty or that proper procedures hadn't been followed. If Sarah's father had papers proving his legitimate claim to valuable land. "Did your father ever deal with a land agent named Hartwell?" Jake asked. Sarah looked up sharply. Yes. Mr. Hartwell was very helpful when we first filed our claim. He said Pa had chosen well, that the land had good water rights and... She stopped, understanding dawning on her face. You think this is about land? Could be. There's been talk that some of the big ranchers are trying to consolidate their holdings, push out the smaller operators. If your father had documents proving his claim was legitimate, and if those documents could also prove that some of the bigger claims were fraudulent, it would be worth killing for, Tom finished grimly. The room fell silent as they all considered the implications. If the rustling was just a cover for a larger land grab, then the danger went far beyond simple banditry. They were talking about powerful men with political connections, men who could make witnesses disappear and cover up their crimes with official approval. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. When they came back to search the ruins, I heard Jameson talking to someone. Someone he called Colonel. Jake and Tom exchanged glances. Colonel Mackenzie? Tom asked. I don't know. They only used the title. Colonel Hiram Mackenzie owned the largest spread in the territory, a sprawling empire of cattle and political influence that stretched across 3 counties. He'd been one of the most vocal opponents of the Homestead Act, claiming it was destroying the natural order of the range. If he was involved with Jameson's gang. We're in deeper water than I thought, Jake muttered. How so? Sarah asked. If Mackenzie's behind this, then Jameson's gang isn't just a bunch of outlaws. They're a private army, and they've got protection from territorial authorities. The weight of this realization settled over them like a heavy blanket. They weren't just facing rustlers, they were up against a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. So what do we do? Miguel asked. Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening landscape. Somewhere out there, dangerous men were hunting for the woman sitting at his kitchen table. Men with resources, connections, and a willingness to kill anyone who got in their way. His father had always taught him that a man's character was revealed not in moments of triumph, but in moments of choice. When everything was on the line, when the easy path and the right path diverged, that's when you learned what you were really made of. Jake had spent his whole life building something on this land. He'd poured his sweat and blood into every acre, every building, every head of cattle. But he'd also inherited something more valuable than land from his father, a code that said some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. We fight, he said, turning back to face the others. We make them come to us, and we make them pay for every inch. Against Mackenzie's resources? Sarah protested. Jake, you could lose everything. He looked at her steadily. I could lose everything anyway. But if I run, if I let fear make my choices for me, then I've already lost the only thing that really matters. What's that? The right to look at myself in the mirror. Tom grinned and slapped his hand on the table. Now you're talking like your daddy's son. Old Bill Morrison never backed down from a fight in his life. My father also never faced odds like these, Jake pointed out. Maybe not, Tom agreed. But he raised you right. That's got to count for something. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, the lonely sound echoing off the canyon walls. In a few hours, dawn would break over the high desert, and with it would come another day of uncertainty. But, for now, in the warm circle of lamplight around the kitchen table, Jake Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the solid certainty that comes from choosing a difficult path because it's the right one. Tomorrow, they would begin preparing for war. Tonight, they were simply 4 people who had decided to stand together against the darkness. Get some rest, Jake said finally. We'll start making our preparations in the morning. As the others headed off to their beds, Sarah lingered in the kitchen. Jake, she said softly. What you said about the man who destroys his weak self, do you really believe that? He considered the question, thinking about all the times he'd compromised, all the fights he'd avoided, all the moments when he'd chosen the safe path over the right one. I'm hoping to find out, he said. That night, Jake lay in his bed listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. Horses shifting in the corral, the wind in the cottonwoods, the distant call of an owl hunting in the darkness. These were the sounds of home, the sounds he'd grown up with, the sounds he'd always assumed he'd die with. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, they would begin a fight that could destroy everything he'd worked for. But, as he drifted toward sleep, Jake Morrison found himself more at peace than he'd been in years. He had finally stopped running from who he was meant to be. Dawn came hard and bright over the Morrison ranch, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and red that reminded Jake of blood and fire. He'd been awake since before sunrise, walking the perimeter of his property and thinking about defensive positions. The ranch house sat in a natural bowl surrounded by low hills, which provided some protection but also meant that anyone approaching would have the high ground. Sarah found him in the barn, checking his weapons. He'd laid out everything he owned: 2 Winchester rifles, a shotgun, 3 pistols, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army if they were smart about it and lucky besides. "Is this all we have?" she asked, running her fingers along the barrel of one of the rifles. "You know how to shoot?" "Pa made sure I could handle a rifle before I could properly milk a cow. Said the frontier wasn't any place for helpless women." Jake nodded approvingly. "Your pa was a wise man. Here." He handed her one of the Winchesters. "This one shoots straight and true. Lever action, holds 15 rounds. Sarah took the rifle and worked the action smoothly, checking the sight alignment with practiced ease. "How do you want to handle this?" Before Jake could answer, Miguel came running into the barn, his face tight with worry. "Senor Jake, riders coming from the east. Maybe half a dozen." Jake's blood went cold. "How far out?" "Maybe 2 miles. Tom's watching them with the spyglass." They hurried to the house, where Tom was positioned on the second-floor landing with an old brass telescope trained on the eastern horizon. 6 riders, he reported without lowering the instrument. "Coming hard but not rushing, if you know what I mean. Professional-like." "Can you make out faces?" "Not yet. But the lead rider's a big man on a black horse. Matches the description of Jameson." Sarah moved to the window and peered out. "It's them," she said quietly. "I can tell by the way they ride." Jake's mind raced through their options. The house was well built and defensible, but it wasn't a fort. If Jameson's men were willing to take casualties, they could overrun it eventually. On the other hand, if they tried to run, they'd be caught in the open with nowhere to hide. "Sarah," he said, "there's a root cellar behind the house, hidden by a false floor under the back porch. If things go bad—" "I'm not hiding," she interrupted. "I've been running for weeks. I'm tired of running. This isn't about courage. It's about tactics. If they get their hands on you, everything we're fighting for is lost." She met his eyes steadily. "And if I hide while good men die protecting me, what does that make me?" Tom lowered the telescope. "They've stopped," he reported. "Maybe a mile out, just sitting their horses." "What are they waiting for?" Miguel asked. Jake had a sinking feeling he knew. "They're not stupid. They want to parley first, see if they can get what they want without a fight." "And what they want is me," Sarah said. "That's right." She was quiet for a moment, staring out at the distant riders. "What if I went to them? What if I told them I'd keep quiet about what I saw?" "They'd kill you the moment you got within rifle range," Tom said bluntly. "Men like that don't leave witnesses, no matter what they promise." A white flag appeared among the distant riders, waving lazily in the morning breeze. Jake cursed under his breath. "Looks like they want to talk after all." "You going to meet with them?" Tom asked. Jake considered it. Jameson would want to test their resolve, see if there was a way to get Sarah without risking his men. It might buy them time, might reveal something useful about their enemy's plans. "I'll ride out halfway," he decided. "You 3 stay here and keep me covered." "I should come with you," Sarah said. "Absolutely not. If this goes sideways, I want you as far from Jameson as possible." 10 minutes later, Jake rode out on his best horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle who could run all day and wasn't spooked by gunfire. He'd strapped on his pistol and taken one of the rifles, more for show than any real expectation of using them. If this meeting turned violent, he'd never make it back to the house alive. Jameson met him halfway across the open ground between the ranch house and the hills where his men waited. Up close, the outlaw leader was even more intimidating than Jake had expected. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox and hands that dwarfed the reins of his black stallion. His beard was shot through with gray, and his eyes held the flat, cold look of a man who'd killed often and slept well afterward. "You'd be Morrison," Jameson said without preamble. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel in a barrel. "That's right. And you'd be the man who murders families in their sleep." Jameson's expression didn't change. "I'm a businessman, Morrison. Nothing more, nothing less. And, right now, I've got business with a young woman who's been telling tales she shouldn't tell." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Course you do. Sarah Mitchell. Pretty little thing, dark hair, green eyes. Saw some things she shouldn't have seen, heard some names she shouldn't have heard. I'm willing to pay good money for her, no questions asked." "How much money?" $5,000. Gold. It was a fortune, more money than most men saw in a lifetime. Enough to buy a dozen ranches like this one, enough to set a man up for life. Jake let the offer hang in the air between them for a long moment, watching Jameson's face for any sign of weakness. "Not interested," he said finally. Jameson's eyes hardened. "You sure about that? That's a lot of money for one little girl." "She's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Morrison. Question is, what's your price? Money? Threats? Maybe something happens to your cattle, your buildings. Maybe something happens to those ranch hands of yours." Jake felt his temper flare, but he kept his voice level. "You finished?" "Not quite." Jameson leaned forward in his saddle. "See, you don't understand the situation you're in. This isn't just about some rustlers and a dead homesteader. There are important men involved, men with reach. You hand over the girl, you get paid and you go on with your life. You don't, and you lose everything. Your ranch, your cattle, your life. And if I believed you were just going to let her go free after I handed her over, I might consider it. But we both know that's not what's going to happen." Jameson shrugged. "What happens to her after isn't your concern. That's where you're wrong." For the first time, something flickered behind Jameson's cold eyes. Surprise, maybe, or grudging respect. "You're making a mistake, Morrison. A big one. Wouldn't be the first time." Jameson straightened in his saddle and gathered his reins. "I'll give you until sundown to reconsider. After that, we come calling, and we won't be offering money. I'll be here." The outlaw leader turned his horse and rode back toward his men without another word. Jake watched him go, noting the way Jameson carried himself, the confidence that came from years of getting his way through violence and intimidation. This was a man who'd never been told no by anyone he couldn't kill or intimidate into submission. Well, today was going to be a new experience for him. Jake rode back to the house at a leisurely pace, partly to show that he wasn't afraid and partly to give his mind time to work through their defensive options. By the time he reached the corral, he'd formed the beginnings of a plan. What did he want? Sarah asked as he dismounted. "You." He offered $5,000 for you, gold. Her face went pale. "That's a fortune." "Jake, maybe you should." "Should what? Sell you to men who murdered your family?" Jake's voice was sharp. "That what you think of me?" "I think you're a good man who's about to lose everything because of me," she replied quietly. Tom stepped between them. "Begging your pardon, miss, but that's not how we see it. Way I figure, those bastards been coming for us anyway. Only difference is now we got a reason to fight back." Miguel nodded agreement. "Besides, Senora Sarah, you are under our protection now. That means something." Jake felt a surge of pride in his men. Neither of them had been born to this land, but they'd both chosen to make it their home. And they understood, as perhaps only men who'd fought for their place in the world could understand, that some things were worth more than money or safety. "All right," he said. "We've got until sundown. Let's use the time." They spent the rest of the morning preparing for siege. Tom and Miguel moved the horses to a small corral behind the house, where they'd be protected from stray bullets. Sarah helped Jake board up the lower floor windows, leaving just enough gap to shoot through. They filled every container they could find with water from the well and moved all their supplies into the house. By noon, they'd done everything they could think of to improve their defenses. The house was as ready as it would ever be, and all that remained was to wait. "Tell me about your family," Jake said to Sarah as they shared a lunch of cold beef and biscuits. "What were they like?" Sarah's face softened. Pa was a dreamer. Always talking about the future, about the farm he was going to build, the cattle he was going to raise. Ma used to tease him about his grand plans, but she believed in them too. "And David." Her voice broke slightly. David was only 16. He wanted to be a doctor, kept talking about going back east to medical school once we got the farm established. "Sounds like good people." "The best. They didn't deserve what happened to them." Jake nodded. "No one ever does. But that doesn't mean we can't make the men who did it pay." "You really think we can win this?" Jake looked around the table at Tom's weathered face, at Miguel's quiet determination, at Sarah's green eyes that held both fear and resolve in equal measure. "I think we can make them wish they'd never come here." The afternoon passed slowly. Tom kept watch from the upstairs window while Miguel checked and rechecked their weapons. Sarah helped Jake go over their defensive plan one more time, making sure everyone knew their position and responsibilities. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Jameson's men began to move. They spread out in a rough semicircle around the house, staying just beyond rifle range but close enough to be a constant, visible threat. "Professional," Tom observed from his position upstairs. "They know what they're doing." "How many?" Jake called up. "Still 6. But I'm betting there's more around somewhere." These types always keep reserves. As if summoned by Tom's words, 3 more riders appeared from the north, approaching at a steady trot. Jake felt his heart sink. 9 men, all experienced fighters, against 3 and a woman. The odds had been bad before, now they were almost impossible. But, as the new riders drew closer, Jake realized something was wrong. These weren't reinforcements for Jameson. They were riding hard, and their leader was waving something white, a flag of truce. "Hold your fire," Jake called to his defenders. "Let's see what this is about." The lead rider pulled up just outside the ring of Jameson's men and shouted something Jake couldn't hear. Whatever he said, it caused immediate consternation among the outlaws. Jameson himself rode over to confer with the newcomer, and, even from this distance, Jake could see that the conversation was heated. "What do you think?" Miguel asked. "I think our luck might be changing," Jake replied. The conference between Jameson and the newcomer lasted several minutes, with much gesturing and what looked like heated argument. Finally, the new arrival wheeled his horse and rode toward the house at full gallop, his white flag streaming behind him. Jake stepped out onto the front porch, his rifle held casually in his hands. The rider pulled up 20 yards away and called out, "You Morrison?" "That's right. Name's Charlie Wade. I'm a deputy territorial marshal. We've been tracking Jameson's gang for 3 weeks." Jake felt a surge of hope, quickly followed by suspicion. "You got any proof of that?" Wade reached slowly into his shirt and pulled out a badge, holding it up so Jake could see. Even at 20 yards, the star was unmistakable. "How many men you got with you?" Jake asked. 12, counting myself. More coming from the south, should be here by morning. What do you need from us?" "Just stay put and let us do our job. We've got warrants for the whole gang." Jake felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. Help had arrived, just when they needed it most. But, as he watched Wade ride back toward Jameson's position, something nagged at him. The timing was too convenient, too perfect. "Tom," he called up to his lookout. "You see anything else moving out there?" "Nothing. Just Jameson's boys and the three that came with Wade." "Keep watching." The sun was setting now, painting the landscape in deep shadows and golden light. Jake could see Jameson's men beginning to move again, but differently this time. Instead of maintaining their siege positions, they were consolidating, drawing closer together. That's when Jake realized what had been bothering him. If Wade was really a federal marshal with 12 men, where were the other 9? 3 men didn't track a gang like Jameson's across 3 weeks of desert. And if there really were reinforcements coming from the south, why weren't Jameson's men trying to break contact and escape? "Something's wrong," he said to Sarah and Miguel. "This doesn't feel right." Before either of them could respond, Tom's voice came urgently from upstairs. "Jake! They're moving. All of them, coming fast." Jake rushed to the window and saw what Tom meant. Jameson's men were charging the house, but they weren't spread out in a typical attack formation. They were bunched together, riding hard and low, as if they were trying to get close as quickly as possible. And then he saw the truth. Deputy Wade and his 2 companions weren't hanging back to provide support. They were riding with Jameson's gang, their badges nowhere to be seen. "It's a trick!" Jake shouted. "Wade's with them." The first shots rang out as the attackers reached the yard, bullets slamming into the wooden walls of the house with sharp, splintering sounds. Jake dove away from the window just as glass exploded inward, showering the floor with deadly fragments. "Return fire," he yelled, working the lever of his Winchester and sending a shot toward the nearest rider. The man spun in his saddle but didn't fall, wheeling his horse around for another pass. From upstairs, Tom's rifle cracked steadily, each shot carefully aimed. Miguel had taken position at the kitchen window and was pouring fire into the attackers with grim determination. Sarah crouched beside Jake, her own rifle ready. "There," she pointed. "The big one on the black horse. That's Jameson." Jake swung his rifle toward the outlaw leader, leading him slightly as he rode across the yard. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, and Jake saw Jameson jerk in his saddle. But the man stayed mounted, firing his pistol toward the house as he rode. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. The outlaws made 2 passes around the house, firing constantly, trying to find weak points in the defense. But the old stone walls held, and the boarded windows provided good protection for the defenders. When the attackers finally pulled back, one of their horses was riderless and another man was slumped forward in his saddle, barely staying mounted. Jake's defenders had come through unscathed, though the house looked like it had been through a war. "They're regrouping," Tom reported. "Looks like they're going to try again." Jake checked his ammunition. He'd fired 8 rounds and had 7 left in the rifle, plus 2 more fully loaded weapons within reach. It should be enough for another attack, but if this dragged on much longer. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens here, I'm glad you didn't turn me over to them." "Nothing's going to happen except that we're going to make those bastards wish they'd never been born," Jake replied, but he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. The second attack came just as full darkness fell, and this time the outlaws had learned from their mistakes. Instead of charging directly, they split into 2 groups, hitting the house from different angles and using the darkness to cover their approach. Jake found himself fighting a running battle from window to window, trying to be everywhere at once. A bullet creased his shoulder, drawing blood but not slowing him down. Another shot shattered a lamp on the kitchen table, spraying oil across the floor. That's when he smelled the smoke. "Fire!" Miguel shouted from the kitchen. "They've set fire to the back porch." Jake's blood turned cold. Fire was every rancher's nightmare, especially in the dry season when everything was tinder ready. If the house caught fire, they'd be forced into the open where Jameson's men could cut them down easily. "Tom," he yelled upstairs. "How's it look from up there?" "Bad. they got the whole back of the house burning. Jake made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation he'd ever developed. Miguel, Sarah, grab buckets and head for the well. We've got to put that fire out. That's suicide, Sarah protested. They'll be waiting for us. If we don't put out that fire, we're dead anyway. They burst out the back door together, Jake and Miguel providing covering fire while Sarah pumped water as fast as she could. Bullets whined past them, splintering wood and kicking up dirt, but somehow they managed to get 3 buckets of water onto the flames before the heat and gunfire forced them back inside. It wasn't enough. The fire was spreading, eating its way up the wooden walls toward the roof. Soon they'd be forced to choose between burning to death and facing Jameson's guns in the open. That's when they heard the sound that changed everything, the thunder of hooves approaching from the south, accompanied by shouts and gunfire. Jake peered out through a bullet hole in the shuttered window and saw muzzle flashes in the darkness, moving fast toward the ranch. Cavalry? Miguel asked hopefully. Don't know, Jake replied. But, whatever it is, it's got Jameson's attention. The outlaws had broken off their attack on the house and were wheeling their horses to face this new threat. Jake could hear Jameson's voice bellowing orders, trying to organize his men for a two-front battle. Through the smoke and darkness, Jake could make out perhaps a dozen riders charging toward the ranch yard, their guns blazing. But these weren't soldiers in uniform. They were ranchers and cowboys, men Jake recognized from town and neighboring spreads. At their head rode a familiar figure, Sheriff Dan Carter from the county seat, his badge glinting in the firelight. Behind him came ranchers who'd lost cattle to Jameson's gang, cowboys who'd lost friends, townspeople who were tired of living in fear. The outlaw gang found themselves caught between the burning house and an avenging force of armed citizens. Some tried to fight, some tried to run, but, in the darkness and confusion, their coordination broke down completely. Jake saw Jameson himself wheel his black horse toward the hills, spurring hard for the safety of rough country. Without thinking, Jake burst out of the house and ran for the corral where Belle was waiting. If Jameson escaped tonight, he'd be back with more men, and this whole nightmare would start over again. Jake, no! Sarah's voice called after him, but he was already swinging into the saddle. Belle was fresh and eager to run, and she responded to Jake's urgency like the fine horse she was. They thundered out of the yard in pursuit of Jameson, following the sound of hoofbeats toward Devil's Canyon. The chase led through broken country, over rocks and through dry washes where one wrong step could mean a broken leg for horse and rider alike. But Jake knew this land like his own face, and Belle had been born and raised on it. They slowly gained on Jameson's black stallion, drawing close enough to see the big man's silhouette against the starry sky. At the rim of Devil's Canyon, Jameson's horse balked at the steep descent, giving Jake the chance he needed. He spurred Belle forward and launched himself from the saddle, tackling Jameson around the waist and dragging him from his horse. They hit the ground hard and rolled, each man trying to get his hands on his gun. Jameson was bigger and stronger, but Jake was fighting for more than his own life. He was fighting for Sarah, for his ranch, for the right to live free from fear. The struggle was brief and vicious. Jameson got his pistol halfway out of its holster before Jake managed to grab his wrist and slam it against a rock. The gun went flying into the darkness, and suddenly, they were fighting with fists and fury alone. Jake had worked cattle and built fences all his life, and his hands were hard as iron. But Jameson had killed men for 20 years, and he fought with the desperate cunning of a cornered animal. They rolled back and forth on the rocky ground, each trying to gain the advantage. Finally, Jake managed to pin Jameson's arms and get his hands around the outlaw's throat. "It's over," he gasped. "Your men are dead or captured." Jameson's eyes blazed with undiminished hatred. "You think this changes anything?" he wheezed. "There's others, bigger than me, they'll what? Send more killers? Let them come." But even as Jake spoke, he could see the truth in Jameson's eyes. This wasn't over. The outlaw leader was just one part of a larger machine, and removing him wouldn't stop the wheels from turning. The colonel, Jameson gasped out. "You don't know what you're up against." "Then, maybe it's time I found out." Jake hauled Jameson to his feet and marched him back toward the ranch at gunpoint. By the time they reached the yard, the fire had been extinguished and the surviving members of the gang were sitting on the ground with their hands tied behind their backs. Sheriff Carter approached as Jake shoved Jameson toward the group of prisoners. "Good work, Morrison. We've been after this bunch for months. How did you know to come here?" Carter gestured toward a young man Jake didn't recognize. "Jimmy Hartwell rode into town this afternoon, said he'd heard talk about Jameson's gang planning something big out this way. We got here as fast as we could." Jake looked more closely at the young man. "Hartwell? Any relation to the land agent?" "His nephew," Carter replied. "Jimmy here works for the Territorial Land Office. Says he's got information about illegal land grabs, forged documents, things like that." Understanding began to dawn on Jake's face. Information that certain people might kill to keep secret. That's right. Jimmy's been gathering evidence for months, but he didn't know who he could trust. When he heard what happened to the Mitchell family, he figured it was time to speak up. Jake looked at Jameson, who was glaring at young Hartwell with undisguised hatred. "Let me guess. The documents Sarah's father had would have proved that some of the big cattle claims were fraudulent." "More than that," Jimmy Hartwell said. "They would have exposed a conspiracy involving territorial officials, cattle barons, even some federal appointees. The Mitchell farm was just one small piece, but their documents tied everything together." "And now that evidence is gone?" "Not necessarily," Sarah said, stepping forward from where she'd been listening. "Pa was careful about important papers. He always made copies, hid them in different places." Jake felt a surge of hope. "You know where?" "I think so. But it would mean going back to the farm." Sheriff Carter spoke up. "Ma'am, I'm afraid that might not be safe. If these people are as connected as Jimmy says, they might have the ruins under watch." "Then, we make it safe," Jake said firmly. "Sarah's got evidence that can bring down this whole conspiracy. It's worth the risk." As they talked, more riders appeared from the darkness. These wore the blue uniforms of territorial militia, led by a captain Jake didn't recognize. The officer dismounted and approached Carter. "Sheriff, I'm Captain Williams. We received word there was trouble out here." Carter nodded toward the prisoners. "Nothing we couldn't handle, Captain. But we appreciate the backup." Williams looked around the ranch yard, taking in the bullet-scarred walls and the smell of smoke that still hung in the air. "Looks like quite a battle. Any casualties?" "Just wounded pride and shot-up buildings," Carter replied. "We were lucky." "Indeed." Williams' eyes settled on Sarah, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the captain's expression was too calculating, too interested. "Captain," Jake said carefully, "you wouldn't happen to know a Colonel Mackenzie, would you?" The change in Williams' face was slight but unmistakable. "Colonel Mackenzie is a respected citizen of the territory. Why do you ask?" "Just curious. Name came up during the questioning." Williams' hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his sidearm. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to have to ask you and Miss Mitchell to come with me. There are questions that need to be answered in the territorial capital." "What kind of questions?" Carter asked, his own hand moving toward his gun. "Official questions. Territory business." The moment stretched taut as wire, with armed men on both sides measuring distances and possibilities. Jake realized that they'd won the battle but might be about to lose the war. If Williams was working for the same people who'd employed Jameson, then Sarah was still in mortal danger. "I don't think so, Captain," Jake said finally. "Miss Mitchell is under my protection, and she stays here until I'm satisfied she's safe." Williams' face hardened. "Mr. Morrison, you're interfering with territorial authority. And you're interfering with a federal investigation," said a new voice from the darkness. Everyone turned as another rider approached, but this one wore civilian clothes and carried himself with quiet authority. He was a small, neat man with intelligent eyes and the soft hands of someone who worked with papers instead of cattle. Agent Samuel Cross, Department of Justice, the newcomer said, producing a leather folder containing official-looking documents. I'm here investigating reports of federal land fraud. Williams looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Agent Cross, I wasn't aware that federal authorities were involved. Now you are. Captain, I'll need you and your men to remain available for questioning. There are serious allegations of corruption involving territorial officials. Jake felt the balance of power shift again. Cross might be legitimate, or he might be another layer of the conspiracy. But his arrival had clearly rattled Williams, which suggested that at least some of what he'd said was true. Agent Cross, Jake said, Miss Mitchell here is a witness to murder. She may also have information relevant to your investigation. Cross turned his attention to Sarah. Is that correct, miss? Yes, sir. My family was killed because of land documents they possessed. Documents that proved several major cattle claims were fraudulent. And do these documents still exist? Sarah glanced at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. I believe so, yes. Then, I suggest we retrieve them immediately, Cross said. Captain Williams, your men can provide security for the operation. Williams looked trapped between competing authorities, unsure which way to jump. Finally, he nodded grudgingly. Of course, Agent Cross. Whatever you need. But Jake could see the calculation in the captain's eyes, the wheels turning as he tried to figure out how to salvage the situation for his real employers. Williams would comply for now, but he'd be looking for an opportunity to eliminate the threat that Sarah represented. The long night was far from over, and Jake Morrison was beginning to understand that the fight for his ranch had been just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The ride to the Mitchell farm began before dawn, a grim procession of armed men moving through the gray half-light that preceded sunrise. Jake rode beside Sarah, close enough to protect her but far enough to give her space to think. Behind them, Sheriff Carter led a mixed group of ranchers and townspeople who'd volunteered to see this through to the end. Agent Cross rode with Captain Williams and his territorial militia, the two federal representatives keeping a careful eye on each other. Jake didn't trust Williams, didn't trust the convenient timing of Cross's arrival, and sure as hell didn't trust the situation they were riding into. But Sarah needed those documents, and every hour they delayed gave the conspiracy more time to eliminate the evidence and silence the witnesses. You sure about this? He asked Sarah quietly as they topped a ridge that gave them their first view of the Mitchell homestead in the distance. She stared at the burned ruins of what had once been her family's dream, her face set in lines of determination and grief. I have to be sure. Those documents are the only proof of what really happened here. The homestead was a blackened scar on the landscape, the house and barn reduced to piles of charred timber and twisted metal. But the root cellar where Sarah had hidden during the attack was built into a hillside behind where the house had stood, and it looked like it had survived the fire. There, Sarah pointed toward a barely visible depression in the ground. That's where Pa kept his important papers. Agent Cross rode up beside them. Miss Mitchell, exactly what sort of documents are we looking for? Surveys, deeds, correspondence with territorial officials. Pa was meticulous about keeping records. He said you couldn't trust the government to remember what it promised you. Cross nodded approvingly. A wise man. In my experience, the most valuable evidence often comes from people who keep careful records. As they approached the ruins, Jake noticed that Captain Williams had deployed his men in a defensive perimeter around the site. It was a reasonable precaution, but something about the positioning bothered him. The soldiers weren't watching the approaches, they were watching the civilians. Tom, Miguel, Jake said quietly to his ranch hands. Keep your eyes open. Something doesn't feel right. Both men nodded and casually checked their weapons. Sheriff Carter, who'd been a soldier himself before taking up the badge, had apparently noticed the same thing Jake had. He began positioning his own men to counter Williams' deployment, all with the casual efficiency of men who'd learned to prepare for trouble without advertising it. The root cellar was partially collapsed but still accessible through a narrow opening that had once been hidden by the house's back porch. Sarah studied the debris for a moment, then pointed to a specific section of the earthen wall. There, she said. Pa built a false wall there, with a space behind it just big enough for a strongbox. Jake squeezed through the opening first, testing the stability of the remaining timbers that supported the roof. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth and old smoke, but the space seemed solid enough. "Hand me a lantern," he called back. Agent Cross passed a lit lamp through the opening, and Jake held it up to examine the wall Sarah had indicated. At first, he couldn't see anything unusual, but when he ran his hands along the packed earth, he found what he was looking for, a section that felt different, more carefully constructed than the rest. "Found it," he called back. It took 10 minutes of careful digging with a knife blade to expose the hidden strongbox. The metal container was small but heavy, secured with a padlock that had been protected from the elements by the false wall. Jake passed it out to Sarah, who held it like it contained her family's souls. "That's it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Pa's private papers." Agent Cross examined the box with professional interest. "Do you have the key?" Sarah reached inside her torn dress and pulled out a small key hanging from a chain around her neck. "Pa gave this to me on my 16th birthday. Said every woman should have secrets that belong to her alone." She unlocked the box with trembling hands, revealing a collection of documents, maps, and correspondence that represented years of careful record-keeping. Cross leaned in to examine the papers, his eyes growing wide as he scanned the contents. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, "these documents are extraordinary. Survey records, original territorial grants, correspondence with federal land officers. This is exactly the sort of evidence we've been looking for." "Evidence of what?" Captain Williams had approached close enough to hear the conversation, and his tone was sharp with suspicion. Cross straightened up, holding a sheaf of papers. "Evidence of systematic fraud in territorial land grants, Captain. It appears that several major cattle operations have been using forged surveys and bribed officials to claim land that was never legally theirs." Williams' face had gone pale. "That's a very serious accusation, Agent Cross." "Yes, it is. And these documents provide the proof we need to bring federal charges against everyone involved." Jake watched Williams carefully, noting how the captain's eyes kept flicking toward his soldiers. The man was calculating something, weighing options, and Jake didn't like the direction his thoughts seemed to be taking. "Captain," Jake said casually, "your men seem a little jumpy." "Everything all right?" "Just being cautious, Mr. Morrison. Never know who might be watching." "No," Jake agreed. "You never do." The moment of truth came sooner than Jake had expected. Williams suddenly stepped back and made a sharp gesture to his soldiers, who immediately raised their rifles and pointed them at the civilians. "I'm sorry, Agent Cross," Williams said, though he didn't sound particularly sorry. "But I can't allow those documents to leave here." Cross looked genuinely shocked. "Captain, what's the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Agent Cross, is that you've stumbled into something much bigger than federal land fraud. Those documents could destroy some very important people who've worked hard to build this territory into something worthwhile." Sheriff Carter stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "Captain, you're making a serious mistake." "The only mistake I made was not handling this situation earlier," Williams replied. "Sergeant Murphy, disarm the civilians." But Williams had underestimated the men he was facing. These weren't frightened homesteaders or isolated ranchers. These were veteran fighters who'd survived range wars and Indian attacks, and they didn't give up their guns easily. The standoff might have lasted longer if not for Sarah Mitchell. While the adults were focused on each other, she quietly slipped away from the group and began running toward a stand of cottonwoods 50 yards away, clutching her father's strongbox to her chest. "Stop her!" Williams shouted, but his soldiers were too far away and too focused on the armed men in front of them. Jake didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol and put 3 quick shots into the ground at the feet of the nearest soldiers, causing them to dive for cover. "Run, Sarah," he yelled, then turned to face Williams. What followed was chaos. Sheriff Carter and his men opened fire on the soldiers while Jake's ranch hands provided covering fire for the civilians. Agent Cross dug behind the ruins of the Mitchell house, still clutching some of the documents he'd been examining. Jake sprinted after Sarah, bullets whining past his ears as he ran. Behind him, he could hear the sharp crack of rifles and the shouts of men in combat, but his focus was entirely on reaching Sarah before William's men could cut her down. She'd made it to the cottonwoods and was using them for cover, but Jake could see soldiers moving to flank her position. He angled his run to intercept them, diving behind a fallen log just as one of the soldiers took aim at Sarah's hiding place. The soldier never got the chance to fire. Jake's rifle spoke once, and the man spun around and fell. But there were more coming, and Jake was running low on ammunition. "Sarah," he called. "This way." She broke from the trees and ran toward him, the strongbox still clutched in her arms. A bullet took bark from a tree inches from her head, but she kept running, showing the same courage that had kept her alive in the wilderness for weeks. Jake provided covering fire until she reached his position, then began planning their next move. They were pinned down between the ruins and the tree line, with hostile soldiers on at least two sides. But Jake knew this country better than any newcomer, and he had one advantage that William's men lacked: desperation born of righteous fury. "Can you ride?" he asked Sarah. "Of course." "Good. See that wash over there?" He pointed toward a shallow depression that ran north from their position. "That'll give us cover for maybe 200 yards, then we'll have to make a run for the horses." "What about Agent Cross?" Jake looked back toward the ruins where the federal agent was still taking cover. "He'll have to take care of himself. Right now, keeping you and those documents alive is all that matters." They began their withdrawal, crawling through the wash while bullets passed overhead. Jake could hear the battle continuing behind them, the sound of rifles and pistols echoing off the surrounding hills. Whether Sheriff Carter and his men could hold their own against trained soldiers remained to be seen, but at least they were buying time. The wash ended at a cluster of boulders about halfway to where they'd left the horses. Jake raised his head carefully to scan the area ahead, looking for signs of soldiers who might have moved to cut off their escape route. "Clear," he whispered to Sarah. "But we'll have to run fast and keep low." They broke from the wash together, running in a crouch across the open ground toward the horse lines. Jake expected to hear shouts of discovery, the crack of rifles aimed in their direction, but the soldiers seemed to be fully engaged with Carter's men back at the ruins. They reached the horses without being spotted. Jake quickly saddled Belle while Sarah prepared a sturdy mare that had belonged to one of Carter's deputies. The strongbox she tied securely to her saddle horn, making sure it wouldn't be lost during a hard ride. "Where to?" she asked as they mounted. Jake considered their options. The territorial capital was a week's ride away, assuming they could avoid Williams' patrols. The nearest federal marshal was in a town 3 days to the east, but Williams probably had allies there too. And anywhere they went, they'd be hunted men and women, carrying evidence that powerful people would kill to suppress. "My ranch," he decided. "It's not perfect, but it's defensible, and I know every inch of the ground." They rode hard away from the Mitchell homestead, following game trails and creek beds that would make them difficult to track. Behind them, the sound of gunfire gradually faded, but Jake didn't allow himself to hope that their friends had prevailed. Williams had too many soldiers and too much at stake to let a few armed civilians stand in his way. 2 hours later, as they rested the horses beside a spring hidden in a rocky canyon, Sarah finally asked the question Jake had been dreading. "What if we can't get these documents to the authorities? What if Williams and his people are too powerful to fight?" Jake looked at the strongbox tied to her saddle, thinking about all the lives that had been lost to protect the secrets it contained. Sarah's family, other homesteaders who'd stood in the way of the conspiracy, probably federal agents who'd gotten too close to the truth. "Then, we make copies," he said finally. "Lots of copies. We send them to newspapers, to federal judges, to anyone who might listen. Make it so expensive to silence us that they'd rather deal with the scandal." "And if that doesn't work?" Jake met her eyes steadily. "Then, we keep fighting until it does work, or until they kill us trying. Some things are worth dying for." Sarah nodded slowly. "My father would have said the same thing." They rode on through the afternoon, staying to rough country where horses left few tracks and sound didn't carry far. Jake's ranch was still hours away, but, with each mile they put between themselves and William's soldiers, their chances of survival improved marginally. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, they finally reached familiar territory. Jake could see the smoke from his own chimney in the distance, and, for the first time all day, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. But, as they approached the ranch yard, Jake realized something was wrong. There were too many horses in the corral, too much activity around the buildings. Either Carter and his men had somehow escaped the battle at the Mitchell place, or Williams had gotten there first. "Stay here," Jake told Sarah, dismounting and pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "If this goes bad, ride for the territorial line and don't look back." "I'm not leaving you." "You are if I tell you to. Those documents are more important than any of our lives." Jake worked his way closer to the house on foot, using the growing shadows for concealment. When he got close enough to see through the windows, relief flooded through him like cool water. Sheriff Carter was sitting at Jake's kitchen table, a bloody bandage around his left arm but otherwise looking healthy. Agent Cross sat across from him, examining papers by lamplight. 3 of Carter's men were visible in the front room, and Jake could hear others moving around in the back of the house. He stood up and walked openly toward the front door, calling out so they wouldn't shoot him by mistake. "Carter!" "It's Morrison." The sheriff appeared in the doorway, grinning despite his wounded arm. "Jake! Thank God you made it. We were starting to worry." "What about Williams?" "Dead," Carter said simply. "Along with most of his soldiers. Turns out some of my boys had military experience of their own." Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "And Agent Cross?" "The real deal, as far as I can tell. He's got credentials that check out, and he seems to know what he's talking about regarding the land fraud investigation." Sarah appeared beside Jake, still carrying the strongbox. "Is it safe?" "Safer than it's been all day," Carter replied. "Come on in. We've got a lot to discuss." Inside the house, Agent Cross looked up from the papers he'd been studying. "Miss Mitchell, I'm very glad to see you safe. The documents you've preserved are exactly what we need to break this conspiracy wide open." "How wide does it go?" Jake asked. Cross spread several papers on the table. "Wider than we initially suspected. It appears that Colonel Mackenzie and his associates have been systematically defrauding the federal government for years, using forged surveys and bribed officials to claim millions of acres of public land." "How many people are involved?" "At least a dozen territorial officials, several federal land agents, and probably some judges. The financial losses to the government run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars." Jake whistled softly. It was a bigger scandal than he'd imagined, involving more powerful people than a simple rancher should reasonably expect to fight. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Cross gathered up the papers. "Now I take this evidence to federal prosecutors in Denver. Within a month, there will be indictments and arrests. The people responsible for your family's death will face justice." "And what about us?" Jake asked. "These people have long arms and good connections. They might decide that eliminating the witnesses is easier than fighting the charges." "That's a legitimate concern," Cross acknowledged. "I can offer you both protective custody until the trials are complete." Jake looked around his house, at the life he'd built on this land. The idea of abandoning it all, of living in hiding while lawyers and judges decided his fate, was deeply repugnant. "What if we stayed here?" he asked. "What if we just went on with our lives and let them come to us?" "That would be very dangerous," Cross warned. "Maybe. But running and hiding isn't much of a life either." Sarah spoke up. "I agree with Jake. I've been running for weeks, and I'm tired of it. If we're going to make a stand, let's make it here, on ground we know." Cross studied them both, perhaps recognizing something in their faces that reminded him why the territory attracted certain kinds of people.